So for the second textural application we're going to be looking at a technique called Soumack. For Soumack, you're going to grab a length of thread that's 4 times the area that you want to have that Soumack length throughout your weaving. So for example, if I'm going across my whole warp, I'm going to have 4 times that width. You'll notice here that I'm only trimming 3. This will end up creating a little bit of an issue that you'll notice later on. So save yourself a little bit of time, give yourself those extra ends. We can always trim off the tails if they're a little bit too long, but it ends up creating a little bit of a headache if it's too short. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have your 2 lengths crossed over the warp. You're going to have that hoop on that one side, and then what you're going to do is you're going to tuck the 1/2 of that length underneath that first warp thread where you're starting your Soumack. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start by going underneath that second warp thread. You're going to cross over, and then what you're going to do is you're actually going to take that end and you're going to pull it through the hoop that loop creates. So I would say do this before you get too far along. So in these next couple ones, I'm going to do that same thing and repeat. So I'm going to go to that third warp thread. I'm going to take my end and put it underneath. I'm going to put my end through that hoop and then pull relatively tight just until that's fastened along the warp, but I'm not getting distortion. Otherwise, you're going to just keep continuing this kind of back and forth of looping around that next warp thread, tucking the tail through that hoop and then pulling tight, and then you're going to just continue all the way until you get to your desired end for the Soumack, whether that is all the way across or if it's just a smaller section. With Soumack, when it's all done, it's kind of hard to tell right now because it's just that loops back and forth. It ends up giving the illusion of almost like a braided texture, which can be nice with the yarn. The one thing to keep in mind is oftentimes thicker yarns work a little bit better for if you really want that really thick, kind of chunky, desired texture of that weave and of that braided effect. That said, it still works out just fine with thinner yarn. It's just a little bit more subtle. So play around with those different thicknesses that we have at the back table. Otherwise, you're just going to continue that all the way over till you get finished up. Once you get around that last warp thread that you're going to go through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up those last little bits of that Soumack stitch, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to weave this tail just underneath and then through that next warp so that I can stitch it in later on. And then for the upper part, we're gonna do almost the opposite of this process. So you're gonna do that same thing where you are going to wrap around that second warp thread, but this time instead of tucking through the hoop, you're gonna just tuck over it. So I'm gonna go to that next warp thread, I'm going to go underneath, and I'm going to let it loop around, and then I'm just going to keep doing this process. So I'm going to go around, pull it tight, loop around that next warp thread, pull it tight, and then this is going to give that illusion of that braided effect because it's going to have that slightly directional pull, whereas if I did this where I'm doing the pulling it underneath and then having it go in the hoop again, it's just going to create like 2 dotted lines. So make sure that you are doing that opposite, where you have that one that's going through the hoop and then the one that is just getting looped around and then pulling tight. And then right about here, I realized that I did not give myself enough of a tail, so I had to go back through and pull and relace pretty much this whole Soumack stitch. So save yourself some time. Make sure that you are giving yourself that 4 times the length of the stitch that you want to do. This wasn't end of the world because I was able to get it finished up, but I don't want you to have to spend this much time going back and fixing kind of a silly error just by having not enough thread. So aim for that 4 times. Otherwise, you'll just continue. And then same thing, you're just going to go to the end of where you want to leave off on your Soumack stitch. Once you get to the end, then what you're going to do is you're just going to weave that length into your weaving, just a couple of those warp threads so that the tail is not directly on the edge. And then that will be the Soumack stitch. I am going to kind of move forward with this. I'm going to do a couple rows of just regular tabby stitch, and then I'm going to show you the next textural application. So I'm going to just kind of fast forward through this part and then get you onto the next piece. And then the third textural application that we're going to look at is called either Rya Loops or Bubble Weave. With this, you're going to grab kind of that arm span length of yarn once again. With this stitch, something that is a little bit tricky with it is it's essentially slip knots that are through your warp threads. It does have the tendency where you can adjust the kind of shape or size of the bubbles or loops. That said, on the opposite side, you can end up kind of pulling out all your work that you've done if you're not too careful. So what I'm going to first start off with is I'm going to give myself just a little row of tabby weave with my desired thread where I want that bubble weave to be. And then once I have that sewn in, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to detach my needle from the yarn, and then I'm going to start this process with the Rya loops. So I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to create a hoop that goes underneath that first warp thread, and then I'm going to take the remainder of my yarn, I'm going to put a hoop through that second hoop, and then I'm going to pull tight until it forms a knot, and then I can adjust the overall size and shape of that loop. And then once I'm happy with that size and shape, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat that process. I'm going to go to my second warp thread, I'm going to pull a hoop underneath, pull the second hoop through, I'm going to pull tight, adjusting my length, and then just repeat. The nice thing with this is it can vary quite a bit as far as texturing. You can leave these loops really nice and long. You can also go through and shorten them up as well too, so it ends up being kind of more of like a bubbly, almost like carpet texture. So either way works out. The range on this can vary so much and can be a really nice effect just to add a little bit more texture and variety. It gives a little bit more of a chunky texture, whereas the Rya knots are a little bit more smooth. Otherwise, you're just going to continue that process of going to that next warp thread, hooping your yarn underneath, pulling tight, and then going on to the next one. And then as you either wrap up with this length of thread or as you add additional yarn, once you get to the end of your yarn and you run out of length, what you're going to do is just let the tail of yarn dangle down. We'll end up trimming this a little bit and then leaving it. And then if you need to continue and add more of that stitch, what you're going to do is you're actually going to knot off that first piece, and then you're going to continue that process going back and forth until you have the desired thickness and shape that you want. Otherwise, that is it for sumac and bubble weave. Let me know if you have questions, but you're good to go.